Dr. Ward, do you want to respond about the point about costs and trying to get some sort of sense of how we can account for the costs of each?
In Germany, utilities are required by law to pay 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour for solar energy. That's approximately 75 cents US per kilowatt hour. That is ridiculous. Therefore, solar energy has no place on the grid in terms of solar voltaics. My understanding of the solar thermal with the heated salts is that you only get about 4 hours of storage once the sun goes down. So it isn't a continuous form of power yet, and I don't know if it ever will be, because there's also clouds in the desert at times. In this zero carbon world, Dr. Makhijani talks about using gas to back up the wind farms. That would mean the gas is running 2/3 of the time. In other words, providing the base load power for the country. That doesn't strike me as being a path to zero carbon. And I do not think you can coordinate the sun and wind like we have some magic wand. It isn't always blowing somewhere all the time, and the sun isn't always shining somewhere all the time. Sometimes there's no wind or sun, and we cannot possibly run the country on frozen meat, I would contend. The fact of the matter is financing nuclear energy is very much like the compact fluorescent light bulb. People don't like paying 5 times as much for that light bulb. But the fact of the matter is it lasts 5 times as long and only uses 1/4 as much electricity and does pay for itself. Nuclear energy is the same. There's a hard pill to swallow at the beginning in terms of the capital cost. But once you have that plant in place, it runs far longer than any gas or coal plant will, up to 80 years, and produces reasonably inexpensive electricity while it's doing so in terms of the cost of production. It pays for itself. Whereas wind and solar either require major public subsidies or these renewable energy portfolios, which are basically state mandates requiring that utilities build more expensive electricity than they would otherwise build if they had a free choice to do so.
Time's up. Let's actually go one more round on this, so if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I didn't say the wind and sun could be coordinated so there'd be wind or sun all the time. I said one of the first things you need to do to reduce the amount of standby capacity you need is to optimize your wind and solar. Then you have some storage associated at the consumer end with wind, and I gave you the CASEnergy example. I gave you 2 different examples of that, and molten salt storage. Well, I have news for you regarding molten salt storage. The amount of heat that you can store in molten salt simply depends on your collector area. It has nothing to do with the molten salt itself. You can simply multiply the number of tanks in which you store the molten salt, and you can have molten salt storage for 10 hours or 15 hours. In fact, it is now being designed and contemplated, and I am certain that plants will soon be built that will have 15-hour storage. So far as the natural gas piece of it is concerned, if you look at the diagram of the electric grid, and I'll be happy to present you a complimentary copy of my book, Dr. Moore, and I recommend it to you, that you'll see that there is a baseload component. In Sweden, for example, a biomass combined heat and power plant was run for 6 years with very low emissions, completely on renewable energy, and they even ran it on straw, which means, and they ran an advanced biomass plant, an integrated gasification power plant, in which you could actually capture the carbon dioxide in principle and inject it into the ground, which means you'd have a renewable source of energy, you'd have some base load, and there is some base load here, so that over the long term, you replace natural gas by biofuels. You replace natural gas by biogas. You have combined heat and power and integrated gasification plants. So there's a whole scheme here that I think is worth studying. Thank you.
And do you want to respond? I'll add.
Well, one expert I would refer to is Vinod Khosla, who's the founder, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems, now the largest investor in clean technologies in the United States, working out of Silicon Valley. He is very clear in his opinion on this, that we cannot simply get all of our electricity from biofuels or all of our transportation fuel from biofuels. They are going to remain niche players, at least until we can develop cellulosic ethanol. And even then, if you look at the amount of energy that we're consuming, and I agree with making the system more efficient, of course I do, and there are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained. But it's extremely expensive to retrofit buildings that have already been constructed. We can much more easily make our new buildings more energy efficient than the ones we have now, but there is a long period of time in terms of the turnover of infrastructure, and trying to make a building like this more energy efficient is not a cheap thing to do. So there's issues of economics here that we have to get our priorities right. And one of the things we have to look at is, I noticed Dr. Makhijani, as with many renewable energy proponents, talks about 5,000 megawatts of wind being installed. What that actually means is 1/3 of 5,000 megawatts, because those wind turbines are only working 1/3 of the time. We should not be talking about installed capacity when it comes to intermittent energy forms. We should be talking about the actual production of electricity that is coming from those machines. You put in a megawatt of solar, all you get is 200 kilowatts. You don't get a megawatt. So we need to remember that in terms of looking at the comparison of prices. Nuclear power plants on average are running over 90% of the time. Therefore, they are producing nearly their capacity.
One of the things that's obviously being hotly debated right now is in Congress the future of energy policy. So I'm curious to ask both of you, I'll start with you, Dr. Bohr, both what you see as sort of a reasonable goal for nuclear power in this country, how much energy it should provide, and what sort of policy steps would be needed to get to that amount. And then I guess ask Dr. Makhijani the same question.
I would get to what amount? I'm sorry, I missed.
How much? So I guess I'll ask you. What percentage of electricity do you see as a reasonable target for nuclear energy, and what further policy steps would Congress need to take? And then for you, what percent from renewables, and what policy steps would be needed? So
first off, clearly, if France can produce 80% of its electricity from nuclear power, so can the United States. But that isn't a reasonable first goal. The first goal should be to double the number of nuclear reactors in the United States to get the nuclear portion up to about 40%, and then think about doubling it again. It seems to me a very important fact when talking about public backing of nuclear and loan guarantees, etc., to remember that the United States is virtually unique in the world in expecting private capital to build electricity generating technology. In France and Canada, my country, and in Britain and in Russia and in Indonesia and in Japan and everywhere else in the world, the government builds these things. They are state-owned corporations in almost every case. And so the taxpayer is taking 100% of the risk. It does not seem unreasonable in the United States, therefore, for the taxpayer to take a piece of the risk. After all, they're the ones that are going to end up using the electricity. The risk needs to be shared among Wall Street, the utilities, and the public if we're going to have solid backing and financing for this very expensive venture of building new nuclear plants. But remember, in other countries, the taxpayer isn't sharing the risk, they're taking 100% of it.
Okay, response.
Well, I don't think that we should be like France with 85% of the utility owned by the government and the 85% of the reprocessing owned by the government and polluting the oceans with impunity while wastes are piling up and nobody wants them in their backyard. I think that private investment regulated properly is a sensible way for electricity, and that's probably why electricity is cheaper in this country than it is in France. To the good of this country, it is. I have the numbers right here. If you want, I'll give them to you. I have said that we need to set a target for 100% renewable energy by the middle of this century. We have a carbon-free, nuclear-free alliance that we have formed that's promoting this goal, and we are confident that we will get there. 200,000 copies of my book have been downloaded in the last year. It's out there. I know people like the CEO of Jim Rogers have seen it. I have invited Jim Rogers publicly to sit down with me if he has any problem with my book. I am a technical person. As I've said, I've worked with utilities. I think that we can accomplish the goal of efficient energy systems and 100% renewable by the middle of this century. And I don't think we need to build any new nuclear power plants. In fact, I think it will be a wrong thing to do. And nuclear power cannot help us overcome the central part of the CO2 crisis, which needs to be addressed in the next 10, 15 years. Renewables can do that, especially if we put efficiency first and coordinate renewables with that. Thank you.